Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya remain the top investment destinations in Africa, with a share of total volume staying steady at 72%. Nigeria retained the top rank, bringing in $1.2 billion in capital, despite a decline of 36% from 2021. This is according to the 7th annual report on Africa Tech Venture Capital by Partech Africa, the VC fund dedicated to technology startups on the continent. The year 2022 was quite challenging for the African tech ecosystem, but it was also a year of growth for startups on the continent. According to the 2022 Partech Africa report, the African tech ecosystem grew faster than all other markets globally, standing out with $6.5 billion, which represents an 8% growth from 2021. And this was spread across 764 deals compared to 724 rounds in 2021.
What's really interesting is the forces of growth that are driving the African ecosystem seem to have won over the downturn. We're seeing a market that has grown 8% to more than $6 billion and maintains the 50% year-on-year growth we've been seeing in the African ecosystem over the last 7 years is maintained.
It was also revealed that Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya remain the top investment destinations in Africa, with a share of total volume staying relatively steady at 72%. Nigeria retained the top rank, bringing in $1.2 billion in capital, despite a decline of 36% from 2021.
If there's been any constant in the ecosystem for the last 5 years we've been issuing this report, is investment has been concentrated in these 4 markets. And it's really not surprising. These 4 markets are obviously some of the largest markets in Africa with the largest GDP, and also markets where the whole emergence and growth of tech in Africa has been most visible. This year, like last year, these top 4 countries are driving 72 to 74% of all investment. However, I think what is interesting is we've seen more and more over the last few years about 4 new markets emerge as the next tier of leaders in the African tech ecosystem. And those markets are Ghana, Morocco, Senegal, and Tunisia. So while it's, again, very concentrated, we're seeing more and more money going to more and more African markets. And this is a sign that innovation is not concentrated. Innovation is everywhere, and the value is being built everywhere. And investors are learning how to go and find the right startups to support in these markets.
The report described 2022 as a tumultuous year for the VC ecosystem, with global funding down 35% from 2021. This stifled growth in activity of equity funding, with a slight decline as 653 African tech startups raised $4.9 billion in 693 equity rounds. Debt funding more than doubled in volume, reaching $1.55 billion through 71 deals. But it was also the year fintech, which remains the most funded sector in Africa and has attracted sizable investments, was the most impacted by the slowdown in the number of large rounds. Other sectors experienced substantial growth and gained meaningful share of the equity funding activity.
If you're going to talk about Nigeria and sectors, of course, fintech comes to mind. But there we notice interesting trends. Fintech has always been the largest sector driving tech investment in Africa overall, and specifically in Nigeria. Last year, fintech accounted for 69% of all investment on the continent and for almost 80% of investment in Nigeria. However, what we've seen this year is a drastic reduction in fintech, because fintech was driven by very large deals, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in a single company. Last year, about 6 companies in Nigeria in fintech raised about $1.1 billion. This year, no company raised more than $100 million in Nigeria. We've seen a drastic reduction in fintech. But at the same time, what we've seen is, while fintech was decreasing, e-commerce, enterprise, logistics have been growing fantastically. So in a sense, what this says is, if you take out the reduction in fintech, the African ecosystem has actually grown beyond any expectation. And it is, again, great news for Nigeria and for the African ecosystem in general, because it means that investors are diversifying away from fintech. They're going into commerce, they're going into enterprise, they're going into logistics, they're going into agriculture. And as we digitize more sectors of the African economy, of course, we are building larger and more valuable startups, but we're also having a larger and more profound impact in the economies and in the lives of African people.
But for female-led startups, not much changed. Partech says female-founded startups contributed 13% of the total equity funding, down 3% from 16% in 2021.
This is the part that I always find a bit sad about the report. The number of rounds and the amount of funding that goes to female-led startups is still extremely low. This 2% increase, it goes ups and down. It will go up and down, but it's always around this number. The whole ecosystem has been pushing very hard to invest more in female-led founders. Whether it's from investors, the female founders themselves are getting together into groups and pushing this narrative. However, the fact that it doesn't move that much probably points to the fact that there is a deeper, more profound cause here that everybody has to work on. It probably starts from access to STEM and how, young girls can get into STEM during their education and stay there. It speaks to access to very early stage financing for female-led companies. It speaks to the trust that everybody in the ecosystem can have to see female-led companies grow into large companies. It is probably something that's difficult to resolve. Again, because I can vouch for the fact that everybody is trying very hard. So it's not easy, but it's something necessary for us to build a valuable ecosystem.
Partech Africa, the VC fund dedicated to technology startups in Africa, aims to provide a practical picture of the state of the ecosystem.